CR101radio.com, podcasts, and more.
12. The Myth of Consent. Chalcedon Report number 141, May 1977. The myth of consent, so basic to the modern age, rests on the doctrine of the sovereignty of man. Because man is sovereign, nothing is valid unless man gives his free assent to it. Where man's assent is not secured, civil disobedience, it is held, is not only justifiable, but sometimes a moral necessity. This doctrine of the sovereignty of man began, of course, as a doctrine of the sovereignty of some men. With Plato, it meant the sovereignty of the philosopher-kings, the elite planners of society, and the rulers of the state. This form of the doctrine is still very much with us and takes a variety of forms. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the Führer principle, the brain trust concepts, and so on. A major and early form of this belief in the modern era was the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Although it pretended to biblical roots, its origins were in ancient paganism. The divine right of kings gave way to the sovereignty of the aristocracy in many areas, and the aristocracy treated the right to rule as their own special privilege, a right of birth and inheritance. The next to claim the right to rule were the middle classes. The Industrial Revolution was their handiwork. They were responsible for the great and important changes in society, and progress had been made dramatically under their leadership. The aristocracy bitterly opposed this rise of the middle classes, and it saw only disaster ahead in this shift of power. The shift occurred all the same, and the aristocracy went into eclipse. Almost at once, however, the middle classes were challenged everywhere. Their own advances had sufficiently improved the lot of the lower middle classes to make them highly articulate and vocal. The lower classes ceased to be the silent, servile, and unknown sector of society and became highly vocal. It was because this new power in society was becoming no longer invisible, but visible, that the aristocracy and intellectuals began to make themselves self-appointed voices of the lower classes. After some time, they gained an appreciative response, and such men as Lenin and F.D. Roosevelt became possible, in person very alien to the lower classes, but in action idolized by them, and made their voices. The intellectuals and aristocrats did not create the new locale of sovereignty. They saw it coming and attached their own ideas and goals to it. The sovereignty of man had begun with kings and concluded with power to the people, a faith used by Hitler, Stalin, and democratic leaders to gain and retain power. The logic of the sovereignty of man had come to mean the sovereignty of man in the mass, and it became necessary for other classes to ally themselves with the masses. When John Locke formulated the doctrine of consent, by consenting man, he meant a very limited class of man. The logic of his myth, however, meant the extension of that consent to all men. If all men are sovereigns, then no man can be compelled, and nothing is valid for any man without his consent. Max Steiner, the great thinker of anarchism, saw this clearly. Granted man's sovereignty, no man could be compelled. All men are bound only by their own will. The state is then only a substitute god, and man cannot allow himself to be coerced by any god. Karl Marx recognized the danger in Steiner's thought. In perhaps his most violent work, he attacked Steiner savagely. Marx realized that the logic of humanism requires that every man be his own god and that no man be compelled. Anarchism, however, for Marx, meant the collapse of humanism into disorder and defeat. The way out was socialism, the sovereignty of the scientific socialist order and its freedom to remake man into that, quote, free, end quote, condition where he would naturally function in terms of an overriding humanistic plan. Thus, in one form or another, the sovereignty of man has led to the enslavement of man, the breakdown of social order, and what Dr. Cornelius Van Til has, in another context, called integration downward into the void. Apart from the sovereignty of God, society has no real principle of law and order. The logic of Steiner is the logic of humanism, of the sovereignty of man. Steiner argued that all men who have any moral hesitation about incest are still Christians, because they are governed by something other than their will. The truly sovereign man knows no law except his own will and desire. Because the truly sovereign man can tolerate no other sovereign, it is a moral necessity for him to defy every law of God and man. As Sartre recognized, freedom then becomes negation. The result, whether in politics or art, is a program of rebellion, revolution, and negation. This, then, is the necessary course of the modern world: rebellion, revolution, and negation, as long as it remains faithful to its humanistic faith. The alternative, the sovereignty of God, declares that there is a mandatory law and order. This mandatory law and order is not the expression of man's sovereignty or of a class interest, but of God's infallible word. Whereas the sovereignty of man leads to a world of conflicting interests, man against God, man against man, class against class, and race against race, the sovereignty of God leads to a total harmony of interests. The universe is totally God's creation, and absolutely serves and fulfills his purpose, which includes the fall and sin of man, and uses it to further his perfect decree. The myth of consent supposedly stresses man's responsibility. In actuality, it destroys it, because it makes an untenable claim of sovereignty for man. Under God's sovereignty, man's creaturely freedom and consent have their place, because man has found his place. The logic of the modern age is leading to attempts at dictatorship almost everywhere, but at the same time a growing threat of anarchy. Because man is a creature, only when he submits to God's sovereignty can man know freedom as a man, a creature.